Greetings. Welcome to End Times Radio with Bart.
And Bob.
And we have as our guest today, Robert Wilcox. He's an award-winning, best-selling nonfiction and novel writer of Screams of Eagles, Wings of Fury, and Target Patton. The plot to assassinate General George S. Patton. Probably had a lot of people in line to do that one. His latest book is Target JFK, The Spy Who Killed Kennedy. In addition to his writing for film and television, he has reported for the New York Times, the New York Post, and written for numerous national and international publications, including the Miami Herald's Tropic Magazine, the Los Angeles Times, and National Geographic. He's a contributor to numerous web publications, including Breitbart and American Thinker. He started his career as a reporter and editor for the Miami News. During the Vietnam War, he was an Air Force information officer. I have to ask you what that is. And he lives at the moment in Los Angeles, and his website is robertkwilcox.com. Robert, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great. Thanks a lot. It's good to be with you.
Tell us, what does it mean to be an Air Force information officer during the Vietnam War?
Well, you are the spokesman for the unit or the colonel or the general, and your job is to liaison with the public, really, or if you're in a war zone or something, to just be the face and the voice of the unit, so that the rest of the guys can do their job. And you get to see everything. You're right there with the head guy and that kind of thing. So it was interesting, but I prefer not to be in the service just so that I can do my writing.
Yeah, and I'm looking here, and I'm going to share it on the screen for people who will watch this and listen to it later on YouTube. You have quite a few books here. And of course, we're going to talk about Target JFK in the first half, and then the Shroud of Turin, a very fascinating subject to me. But you've written quite a bit. What was the first book that you wrote?
The first book I wrote was Shroud. It was the first, really the first big book here, actually the first book in English in America. Nobody had ever heard of the Shroud of Turin. This was back in 1977, and as a religion editor at the Miami News, I heard about it, and I was actually brought up as a Protestant, but when I heard that there might be some sort of tangible proof of Jesus and his resurrection, I jumped on that story, and I wrote a series of articles for the Miami News. They got a lot of interest. Nobody had ever heard of this thing. I mean, there was a little shrine in New York, and that was it. It was known in Europe a little bit, but not much. And so in those days, you could actually get. I went to New York, knocked on doors, and got a publisher. I got Macmillan, very fine publisher, and I wrote that book. That was the first book I wrote.
Well, let's talk a bit about that. I'm about 20 years younger than you, and it seems to me I remember hearing about the Shroud maybe in the 80s at first. It must have been from some of your articles, I suppose. And I grew up Catholic, stopped going the day it became voluntary. What a coincidence. And I always found it very fascinating. I did a little bit of research prior to this interview about it. But from what Bob was telling me, there's kind of like your original writing and this book here that I've got on the screen from Amazon that has some updated information. Is that right?
Yeah, well, it's a huge difference. The first book, I went to Europe. I was lucky. At the time that I decided to do the book, the first one, they were going to take the Shroud out to be seen for the first time since 1933. It was owned by the King of Italy. And I went on a bet, or on not a bet, but a hope that I would be able to see it. And I actually was right up there and made the first color photos ever of the Shroud of Turin. I was right in front of it. So I got an inside track. And that book, Shroud, was really my search for the truth kind of thing. And I went literally all over the world, all over the U.S., and I would take it's a scientific story. Because I'll tell you right now, the Shroud is indecipherable at the least. It's the cloth which wrapped Jesus, in my belief, and that's from a scientific standpoint, not from any other standpoint. But when I wrote that first book, it was a big, big success. One of my most successful books, and then we went a long time, 75 until 2012. Okay, so you're looking at 40 years in between there. And in between, there were these carbon-14s. The Shroud became so controversial. And let me say, it's not controversial amongst people who have studied it, but the press knows nothing about it. They still don't. It takes a while to understand it and to know what you're talking about. And so there's always this, well, half think it's real and half don't. No, there was a scientific study, a group of scientists, and they either think it's inexplicable or they think it's the burial cloth of Jesus, the historical Jesus. There are only two people I know of who ever did any writing that it was not true. But of course, there have been a few little others, but who made any dent in that. And so anyway, I came back 40 years later, and it had many people then had heard of the Shroud. They know what it is. It has been, there have been many, many, many books and articles written about it since that time. And I went back and studied it all and took my search, which went from place to place, from scientist to scientist, and however built a lot of new information around it. So the book you're talking about, my latest, called The Truth About the Shroud of Turin, Solving the Mystery, is really all that had happened since then, and all of the science that has occurred since then, which really made it much more mysterious than it was when I had looked at it.
Now, you said you were looking for the truth. Were you talking about the truth about the Shroud itself, or the truth about Jesus, to find evidence that Jesus was the Messiah?
No, the truth about the Shroud. And listen, if the Shroud is real, which I believe it is, that it did wrap the historical Jesus, it has in it a picture of the resurrection. This Shroud has the face and body, entire body, of a crucified man on it. It is not a painting. There's no paint on it. It boils. It is so intricate that since I wrote the first book, scientists have found out that the image is a subtle thing, almost like I wouldn't want to say a burn, but like you would get from that light that will hit a white shirt and make it look ultraviolet light, and on every fiber of the image, this is very subtly put onto it, about only on the tips of the fiber. And so anyway, this is not a painting. It's not even an impression, because there are areas of the body that like the sides of the nose, which are on this image, which would have distorted this image if it were pressed down. And what I think you have there is the moment of resurrection, when the body turned from a material into pure energy, which of course we know today can happen now. That's all material is real energy. You have to take it back to its atoms and neutrons and so on. At that moment, something happened, and that body turned into a spiritual body, and that image was impressed. And I think that image, as the body lifted through the cross, through the shroud, it was put on there. And of course, that's speculation from me, from the facts, because how can you prove that happened? You can't, but you can go through all of the science that's there, and it's incredible. And so I wasn't looking to prove the message of Jesus, although I believe in the message of Jesus. I was just looking to see, what is this cloth? What is it? Is it really a picture of Jesus when he died after the crucifixion, as the scriptures tell us? He was put into a tomb, and there was a burial cloth put over him, and so on. It all coincides, but no, it was simply to do that. Now, since then, and because of what I found out, and because I've spent a lot of time examining my own life and so on, I do believe in the Christian message. I do believe Jesus was the Son of God, but this tries to stay as scientific as I can be, and it is scientific. It's just, I don't put my beliefs in on you. I tell you what the science tells us about the shroud.
Now, I remember hearing around that time, I was a teenager, that someone had done a carbon-14 dating of it, and it dated to around the 13th century like that. And then, of course,
Yeah.
when I read your discovery, you're saying that dating was incorrect because of the fiber was corrupted by burned ashes of some kind. Tell us about that.
Yeah, you got a general idea there. Yes, that was quite a big blow. They did carbon 14s on the cloth, and the Vatican, which was finally given the cloth by the King of Italy, was very, very. They don't care whether you believe it or not. They don't want you to do anything, but scientists were so impressed and so wanted to do something that they let them take a little tiny piece of the shroud, a piece of the cloth, which was a big deal to them. They didn't want to do it, but they went ahead and did it. And unfortunately for all those who definitely, and it was a very biased test, but I won't get into that, they didn't know it, but what they had been given, and even the people who gave it to them, who let them take the piece off, didn't realize it. But what they took was a piece of a patch that had been very beautifully and wonderfully interwoven into the shroud, and that patch had been put on in approximately the 14th century after a fire had hurt the shroud, and some nuns had patched it up, and that's a great art in Europe, and you can do it. So there are some people who can do it so well you can't tell there's a patch there. Anyway, that's what they tested, and sure enough, it tested 14th century, and the people who were doing this test just gloated about it. You fools! Now we've shown you that you're idiots and you're wrong. Well. And it did make a lot of people who thought the shroud was real. It really hurt. But as we began to think about it and so on, and then I won't say we, but certain people who believed in the shroud had really dug into it deeply, began to unearth this idea that, wait a minute, maybe something was wrong here. And in fact, they found out that this had been taken from this patch that had been made on the shroud. And this has been verified again and again, so that's no longer an issue. The carbon-14 was wrong, and in fact, it is now very. I mean, I can give you the historical history of it. I can almost verify it that way, but there's been pollen found on the shroud that was in plants only at the time of Christ, and there are numerous new ways to date the shroud. The biggest is in Italy at one university. Two researchers have found evidence of a type of chemical in the cloth that would only have come from that time, the time of Christ. So the carbon-14s are no longer an issue. However, if you are just casually talking about it, most people, that's what they remember, is the carbon-14s knocked the shroud out of. It's not true. But one other thing I'll say to you, scientists today, because of the intricacy of the image, and because they couldn't figure it out, and because it's so subtle. They can put and every tiny I don't want to say twig, every tiny piece of the cloth that has that image on it is exactly the same. And there are millions of those that are on it, all over, that make up the image on the cloth. They can take a space age called VP8 image analyzer. It's like putting a computer over it, and every thread, that's the word I was looking for, every thread returns the exact same image, so much so that they can make now a 3D image of the man in the shroud. That is, if you've ever seen a 3D image, we use them a lot in space when you've got things that are so far away they can't do anything but run this VP8 image analyzer over it, and then they can make it look real. They can pull the man out of the shroud, look at him from the front, from the back. That in itself shows you that there's just no way this thing could have been made through any 14th century way of making it. And we have, that's an absurd idea, but it was good for a while when they dated it to there.
Why didn't they just take another sample and carbon-14 date it a second time?
I told you earlier the answer to that, and that is that it took a long time, nearly a century of studying the shroud before the church, first the king and then the church, would allow that. They don't care whether you believe it or not, and they're certainly not going to let anybody come in and cut up pieces of the shroud in order to satisfy their own curiosity. I think it will eventually happen again, but it's not going to be needed. I'm telling you, they've already dated it now. Those Italian professors, what they used was some sort of ray that will go through the cloth without harming it. And they found the chemical analysis that shows them that it would have to be at least around the time of Christ. So I don't think they're going to even need to do that anymore, and that's the only reason that it hasn't been done a lot. You know, they're not going to. It's like you had a beautiful boat that you hand carved or something. You're not going to give people pieces of it to test. You love it. What do you care whether they love it?
Now, when you actually are standing there and looking at it like you have done, can you see the image that I have the enhanced version, kind of the negative, if you will, which I'm sure you've seen many pictures of. When you're there physically in front of it, can you see what I'm seeing now, or is it very difficult?
No, you see a negative. You see something like, remember the old photographic negatives that all blacks were whites and whites were black?
Right.
And it looks real strange. That's what you see on the surface of the cloth.
But you still discern a face, though.
What?
You still discern a face and hands, right?
You can see, but it's like, you remember those old negatives? Okay, it's just like that. It looks like someone with wide eyes, and everything is distorted, positive to negative. You're looking with your naked eye. You are looking at a negative on the cloth.
I remember doing.
The way you see the positive is you have to take a picture of the cloth, and then you look at the negative of it, and then you see the positive. Then you see the man in the shroud. Then you see what everybody looks at and is amazed at.
I looked up at one point the first photograph ever taken, and I don't remember exactly, but it was something like 16th century. It was like an accident, and it was like a shadowy, negative-looking window, with the tree outside of it or something like that. It was some sort of chemical effect that the person did without even realizing they were doing it. That's kind of what it looks like to me, that if this is Jesus, if he were resurrected and maybe his body had a burst of light at the moment of resurrection, then it caused this basic photograph, if you will, onto the cloth. Now, as I was reading about this...
Let me stop you right there.
Sure.
There was no photograph of the shroud taken in the 16th century. The first photograph was.
Oh, yeah, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, if you look up the history of photography, they have a picture they say is really technically a photograph from like the 16th century. It's of like a room or a desk or a window or something.
Yeah, no, I understand what you mean now.
And basically, it was a chemical effect that kind of happened by accident. And so I'm saying that something like that is probably the explanation as to why, if this is Jesus, when his body was resurrected, there was a beam of light maybe at all points of his skin, and that kind of caused this crude photographic effect.
I think that the body turned from material flesh into pure energy, and at that moment there was that light, and that's what made this picture.
Well, I was discussing this with my wife last night, and she said, well, Bart, what do you think? And I said, I think it's a greater than 50% chance that it is the burial cloth of Jesus, and I'll tell you why, Robert, because growing up Catholic and yet searching out biblical truth, like about the Sabbath, we can go into that, why the Sabbath is really Saturday and things like that, and the Catholic Church and all of their art, they depict the nail going through the palm of Jesus. But back in Jesus' day, the wrist was considered part of the hand. And as you may have studied, if you crucified somebody, there was never any rope and there was never anything for the person to stand on like in the movies. They nailed the guy to a tree. And if they put nails in the person's palm, it would tear and he would fall. So they put it just, in the top part of the wrist, and that's what held them to the tree. So I said to myself, if this is a work of art, then they're going to have the nails through the palms. And if it's not...
That's one of the good arguments, Bart, and that's certainly part of it, and I agree with you 100%, but there's so much more, and that's... It's in my book, or you could read other books about the Shroud of Turin, and you'll see that, but that's a very good point. The nail is in the wrists. Now, there were some crucifixions where they put people on a seat, and so you could have done it that way, but I don't think that we have we have very little historical evidence of actual crucifixions. We have one guy that they dug up in Israel. His name is Yohanan, and he was, I believe, on a seat, but this is a good point, and there are so many other deviations from tradition. The cap of thorns is not your wreathlet that goes around just the main part of the head. It's a total cap, which is a mitre, which they did wear in those days. There are many deviations from the traditional Jesus that are in this cloth that are part of the argument of why this is real.
What do you think, Bob? What questions do you have for Robert?
One of the things I noticed when I was reading your book was when they found the shroud, there was also a nail found in the vicinity of the shroud.
That I don't know. I think what you're looking at is a picture that I had in the book, which is showing a nail that was typical for crucifixion. As far as, when you say when they found the shroud, well, all we know is that in the Gospels, the women go to the tomb, they run inside, and they see that the body is gone, and they see that there is a shroud there, and then there's a face veil. And they gather those, we assume, and run out, because those are the only material evidence of it. The next thing we hear of the shroud in the history of the Shroud of Turin is that most probably it is the relic that was dug up in a wall in Edessa, Syria, 500 years later. And we presume that the Christians, since this was the only material evidence of him, that they kept the shroud with them. And it's called the Mandelion, and we think that's the shroud. And then it goes on, and we know for sure that the shroud face, that a shroud with the face of that's in the shroud was in Constantinople in the 12th century, and when we go on until the where we can go document to document. It starts in Liry, France, in the 13th century, when the shroud is documented to be in the possession of a Knights Templar, and the Knights Templars were those who went to Constantinople and fought the Islamics there, and so on. Since then, we also have other pieces of evidence which pretty much nail down all the history back to that part. But I know of no nail that was found with the shroud. That, as far as I know, did not happen.
Well, it just said ancient Roman nail found.
Yeah, that's an ancient. They have found an ancient Roman nail, and there's a picture in my book of the ancient Roman nail, and it shows you the nastiness. The thing's about 6 inches long. It's crude, and we are thinking that's what went through his wrists. But that was not found with the shroud.
That was my mistake. The way I read it, I thought that it was. I was just wondering, the people who've been your biggest critics, how biased do you find them? Were they people who just tried to look at the evidence, or do they have an agenda?
Go ahead, Robert, with that question answered.
Yes, of course there's a bias. Look at the press today. I mean, in every sense there's a bias of what they want. But I think the key thing to remember here is not only is there a bias against religion, against Christianity, all of that is very strong today, but nobody who comments on the shroud, very few who comment on the shroud in the press know much about it. They just assume it's not true, and therefore they'll give you a but let me tell you, I will debate any one of them. They don't know what they're talking about. They always say in every article, the world is split between whether or not they believe whether or not people believe it's true or not, or scientists. Scientists are not split. Scientists are 98% in either it is indecipherable, it's a mystery we cannot explain, or it actually is the burial cloth of Jesus. The people who say it isn't, that 2%, are people like Walter McCrone, who said that it was a painting. It is not a painting. That's just absurd. There's no paint on the shroud. This has been documented and documented. Or Joe Nickel, who doesn't even, he says it's a painted fake from then. Again, and neither one of those people, those are the two people who've actually studied the shroud and come off like that. And they too are very biased. So bias is a big thing, but I don't like to say that as much as I do. Ignorance is really what is driving the idea that, oh, the Shroud of Turin is nothing. It's just a painted fake. It's ignorance. They don't know the facts.
What's interesting is you said scientists don't know how the image got on there. They can't really explain how it got on there. You and I have our kind of photographic resurrection light theory, and that's probably true. But without that, science says, yeah, there's an image on there, but we don't know how it got there. To me, that's pretty much saying it's miraculous.
Absolutely. And remember, that's after 120 years of. The first photograph is when science got interested. The first photograph was taken in 1898. A guy named Secondo Pia in Italy. They were going to bring the shroud out like they always did at big occasions, like the crowning of a king or something like that. And they did it about every 50 years, something to that effect. So photography had been really invented and had come along to the point that they said we should make a photograph of the shroud in 1898. And it was when he looked at his plates and saw that he had seen the same thing I did, and we all see, which is that negative image on the shroud, and it doesn't look real. It looks like a negative. It looks funny. It looks unreal. But when he looked in his negative plate, he was souping it. Back in those days, they had to put chemicals on plates that you would soup it in there, and an image would come out. A silver had to do with photography then. And he looked in there, and he couldn't believe it. He saw a real live, or real, an authentic dead corpse. And that was the beginning of science becoming interested. And I go through all of this in my book. It's a very extremely interesting story of the bias that was used to kill that. There were some scientists who said, wait a minute, there's got to be an explanation for this. And they tried to explain it in terms of a chemical reaction between the body and the cloth. And one of these scientists, who was a big deal guy back then in France, and they were the leading scientific bodies of the world at that time, they tried to bring this in front of the French Academy, and the French Academy wouldn't listen to them. Pure bias, and that's all explained in this. And a great scientist named Marcellin Berthelot, he would not allow their data to be printed in the French Academy, and so that's the way it's always been done. Those who are against God and are against any kind of thing like this, they laugh and they shriek at this stuff, and they want to prove it, and that's what happened with the carbon-14s. There were definite standard operating procedures that were violated, but they got tripped up. Their specimen wasn't any good, but you should have seen them gloating when they came out and said, "Hey, it's a fake. We dated it to 1300s."
Well, as you know, science is political and facts are political, and we'll move on to another one of those controversies. This is one I know especially interests Bob. Your other book called Target JFK, The Spy Who Killed Kennedy. I've done, a fair amount of research into the JFK assassination just because it's such a strange thing to me when the assassin is assassinated. To me, that just is so clear there's a backstory. You know what I mean? When it's so set up that it doesn't go to trial. Let me just have you start with, you've discovered some new information about this, a new character player, if you will, and what was going on. It says here, I'm reading from the Amazon description, he was born in Buenos Aires and educated in Geneva and Cuba. He was a daring World War II paratrooper who parachuted behind enemy lines on D-Day. He was a handsome, charming man who briefly worked as a Hollywood stuntman. He was also a spy who may have killed John F. Kennedy. The shocking new book, Target JFK, reveals page after page of incredible, never-before-reported evidence that a mysterious Argentinian with a stranger-than-fiction life story is the missing link in the assassination mystery that has puzzled America for half a century. So tell us about it.
Well, you just described René A. Dussac, and he is a fascinating story in himself, and is absolutely enthralling to read his story. And he was a spy, and nobody knew about this guy, although there have been little things that have gone on. But in writing my book, Target Patton, which is a big book now, about the assassination of General George S. Patton, which I believe that he was assassinated. I found the assassin who was the basis of that book, Douglas Bazada. And Bazada, I went and interviewed him for the book and spent 2 weeks with him, and he had had a stroke, and that's the only reason I was able to get this from him. But he had a bunch of diaries, and those diaries helped me with the book that I subsequently wrote, Target Patton. But in them, I kept running into another story, and it turned out, I thought it was about JFK, and it turned out that Bazada had this friend, René Dussac, and let me tell you, Bazada was just as good as they come. He was a great fighter, a Jedburgh. These were the guys who jumped into France and helped the Maquis. He's a man's man, and so on. And later on was involved in the Cold War. Well, it turned out Bazada's diaries were in a kind of a code, and I had to work on them. But it turned out that he had this great relationship. One of his best friends was René René Dussac. And René Dussac was the man you just described in the opening. And René Dussac, it says in these diaries, conceived the plan to kill JFK and carried it out and was there in Dallas to do it. And you brought up Oswald. He was made to use Oswald because throughout this plot that is in the book that is uncovered in these secret diaries of Posada's, there is somebody over Dussac who kind of calls the shots. And so he had to use Oswald, and there's the story about that. But René Dussac, you've seen the beer commercials, the most interesting man in the world. He was every bit that guy. He was born in Argentina. You know, if it wasn't for this dark secret that I believe is probably true. I can't absolutely prove it in this, but you know, we're 53 years into this and nobody's come up with it yet. It's time that stuff like this happens, that secret diaries are found and they tell a new story, at least story that hasn't been told yet. But Dussac himself is born in Argentina. His father was a Cuban diplomat, and Cuba was his allegiance, which is very key here. His father was a Sufi prelate and taught him all these mind and body things. And Dussac's a big, strong guy, and he also used mind control almost to keep fear from himself. There's a famous line when he got into the OSS. The reason he got in is they said is the people who promoted him said, listen, this guy has no fear. The more fear comes to him, the wider he smiles. That to me was a tremendous draw to write about him. But he was educated in Switzerland and spoke 6 languages, and he was an Olympic athlete, and he got involved early in Cuban revolutions and had to leave there. I think he killed somebody, and he came to Hollywood and became a stuntman here, and he used to dive off of tall ships and fight sharks underwater. When you see those old pictures, that's Dussac there. And when the World War II came, he became a Jedburgh, which was our first special forces, large special forces, were the Jedburghs. And these were the special forces of the OSS, which was the forerunner of the CIA. And they were jumped into occupied France to fight the Nazis and to show the Maquis how to fight. And he did that and won big awards. And he and Posada got together there, although they had known each other since they were both teenagers in Cuba. Posada being a Marine and Dussac being a member of the Cuban intelligence. And they had some run-ins there, but they began to like each other. And so here they are together then as Jedburghs, and they really bonded then. And Dussac was going to go with Posada after the war and become kind of a freelance special forces guy. Posada was organizing that to help a lot of countries, and they would go into Russia and so on. But he left and he went back to Cuba, and he was appalled at what he found, which was basically that the mafia had taken over, that Cubans had no decision, that America ran Cuba, and he decided that he was going to end that. And one of the reasons he said this was going on, he looked at the Kennedys, not John F. John F. Kennedy hadn't even been elected yet, but the father Kennedy was a guy who he didn't like, and I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but he wanted to free Cuba, and it says in the diaries that Dussac picked among several people who might help free Cuba, and that was his big thing. He wanted Cuba for the Cubans. He wanted Cuba to be able to make its own decisions. And this is not my politics. These are Dussac's. And he picked Castro from those guys and helped Castro. And it's very, very fabulous about their relationship in these diaries. Because remember, I'm getting the story from Bazada, who got it from Dussac. And Bazada only emphasizes what he remembers and what he got. But anyway, they bring, he helps, Dussac does, Castro to power. And finally, when JFK was elected the president and did try to kill Castro, which he did many times, this was the thing that sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. Then Dussac said, "Okay, then we can kill you." And this was, I think, the Bay of Pigs were before they tried to kill Castro. All of that had happened. We tried to invade Cuba. We tried to kill Castro, and this is when the plan, which had always been there in theory and in intent, took shape. And they began to, Dussac began to plan this, and Bazada did not want to be involved. After all, he's an American. He didn't want to do this. But Dussac was an American, too, and I always explain this, is he just couldn't see the tree. He couldn't see the forest for the trees. And it has to do with the type of person he is. A very interesting and I mean, we don't have these kind of people anymore, although I suppose they are in other factors. But so Dussac began to make this plan, and I want to say that the mafia could have been involved in it, because there are indications in the diaries. Oswald is a patsy, as he always said he was, and there's a very strange story about that. The story that came out of Bazada's diaries does not go against some of the pet theories that everybody has, but I'm afraid that it doesn't zero in on anything that people can go, "Oh yeah, I knew it was Dussac, I knew it," because they never heard of him before. And then the book goes on to prove that this really happened. Bazada's, I have letters that Bazada wrote to very credible people talking about it. Never ever telling this was Dussac's name, because he always kept that, and he was never. And by the way, just today, I got an email from Bazada's son, who was estranged from Bazada. They never really saw each other. I think it was from a marriage which didn't work out. And he said, "Yes, my father told me about this, and he confirmed a lot that I had written in the book," which was really interesting to me. I had not been able to get anybody. Bazada's dead. Dussac is dead. I have heard from Dussac's relatives, which really interesting to me, have no problem with what I wrote. They agree, and they never knew half of this. So I'll stop right there. That was sort of a diatribe on what I've written.
Well, how did...
A fascinating part of the book to me involved Lucien Conine, a CIA agent who retired in about 1968 and then went on to be a businessman in Vietnam. He's been pretty much, it's accepted that he was instrumental in helping remove Diem on November 2nd, 63. So Vietnam lost their leader 20 days before Kennedy was killed, and then our war policies changed. So Kennedy was killed on the 22nd of November, and Diem was killed on the 2nd, and then Lucien Conine had written a letter reproduced in your book where he was saying that Bazada had come to him, and several times they were saying they tried to out the plot before it came to fruition. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, it's very good you bring that up, because Conine was a Jedburgh too. They were all in the same sort of milieu, and yes, it's a very strange story, but real basically, Dussac felt that what America was doing was horrendous. That is, controlling Cuba, most famously shown when we see in the Godfather movie how they cut it up into pieces, a cake made with Cuba. And Dussac felt that that the American people would understand how bad this was, and therefore would go along with the idea that their leader had to be killed to stop this thing. And so Dussac, part of the plan was that way after JFK was killed, Posada was to tell the story. And prior to that, before they did assassinate Kennedy, Posada was to go to his contacts at the CIA. And by the way, he had top contacts. The head of the CIA at one time, I forget his name now, William Colby was his name.
Colby, I was going to ask how they were.
Colby was a good friend of his. So he went to people, but at this time Colby wasn't yet the CIA head. So he went to the heads of the CIA, and he said, listen, there's bad stuff going on. I happen to have found out about it, and you've got to get your hands off of Cuba, or something will happen to JFK. And he was stonewalled. The phone was clicked off. They didn't give him what he thought they would give him. Would be, wow, what's going on? Tell me about this, Boz, because you're one of us, and he got scared. So he went to Conine and he said, hey, listen, I may be in big trouble. I have told the CIA that he's going to be killed, JFK is, and they're not responding to me. They're not listening, and therefore I may be killed. So he went to Conine, and Conine, one of his good buddies, said, sure, I'll tell you. And they made a document which showed that for 3 or 4 times before the killing, Posada had come to Conine, and they talked about it. And you brought up the killing of Diem. In the letter, in the document, Conine says, hey, that's when I was running the Diem operation, so I remember this very well. So that's what that's about, and it spotlights the kind of strange, unheard of thinking of someone like Dussac, who would think that the American people would buy this, would go for this.
I mean, did he really think in Cuba, like these two guys are obviously quite sophisticated, and as I first, read the book, I'd liked your earlier works, but as I first read the book, I said, who are these fellows? As you said, nobody in the world of JFK knows them. But as you talked about their background, these were very serious players. But when they get very high up in intelligence, you always wonder if it's possible that they're putting out, a slight deflection in the story. So that's why I just wondered what you thought when Diem went out on the second, and it's pretty accepted Conine is in on that, because, Fletcher Prouty, who was also a lieutenant colonel, as the same as Conine, had actually, and he's a pretty serious fellow, he's not like a National Enquirer type fellow at all, and he actually said in one picture they had, believed Conine might have been in Dealey Plaza, and then our Vietnam policy changed, so I know some of the people who study this are going to want me to ask that question. Is it possible that Conine was involved in it, and he's coming out with this letter and such, trying to say, hey, we were trying to tell everybody, because he was actually possibly involved in it?
Well, that's certainly a possibility, and I'll tell you that I'm not quite sure Posada wasn't involved in it. There's a strange situation that Posada happened to be in America. He lived in Europe. All of his operations were in Europe. However, he's in Europe. He's in New York City about 2 weeks after, I know for sure, with Salvador Dali. Now, you know who Dali is, the famous artist. There's a New York, when Posada died, the picture of the two of them together at that time was there. And I don't understand that, because when Posada and Dussac would meet, they would go to Europe. Dussac would fly to Europe most of the time. Sometimes Posada would come to America, and they would phony up their flights. They would use phony names and so on. But my point is, why would Posada come at that time? Dussac would have come to see him after the killing. So I don't understand that part. But yes, there's a possibility of that. That could be why that was drawn up. But in any case, it is more of the same.
Everybody has to read the book, Target JFK, The Spy Who Killed Kennedy, to get the whole story. But that being said, I have to pick out the things I thought were nuggets that were the most interesting to me.
Yeah, I have a specific question about the details, Robert. You're saying that Dussac was the trigger man with the fatal shot, and if so, where was he on Dealey Plaza?
He was in front, and as the diaries relate, there's a trick they do with Oswald, and I won't get into that. But Oswald shoots a bullet that was put into his gun that actually disintegrates about 10 feet in front of it, and Oswald figured that out. So the first shot was not a real shot. Oswald then put some more bullets in and did get a shot off, but the first shot was the signal for Dussac, who it says in the diaries was in front of the car, and I don't know whether it's in the grassy knoll or in a building in front or on that overpass. It's up. It is not clear, but he wanted to make the first shot, so his shot is the first real shot. It is fired. It comes into the throat, and you must read all of the doctor's reports from Dallas to realize that something happened to the body from Dallas to Washington, and they covered up that the first shot comes that the shot came into the throat. That's how he was killed. And then there's another shot by one of the CIA rogues that are working with them, and that one probably is a finisher-offer. I don't know. You'd have to read the book and make your own judgment on that. But there are 3 shots, I believe, fired that are real. Oh, and then one of them might be Oswald firing when his second shot is a real bullet. You'll just have to read that and make it out. But he was in front, and if I had to guess, I'd say he was on the grassy knoll.
Now, when we talk about Oswald, in fairness, they gave him a paraffin test that day, and he passed the test. In other words, he hadn't fired a rifle that day, according to them. And Barry Ernest did a book, The Girl on the Stairs, where he talked about a witness that he would have had to run past people to get down because the elevator was locked, and he hadn't passed anyone, so he wouldn't have been on the 6th floor. So, I was just wondering, the part of
let me address both of those.
Sure.
In the diaries, everybody wears gloves and has other ways to keep the paraffin off. I don't know if that happened. I'm just telling you that's what the diaries say, and if that's the truth, then that would explain why he passed the paraffin test. As to the other one, him running down the stairs and so on, you know that it says in the diaries that they had fakes there, and I personally, the only connection I ever had with the JFK killing as a journalist, I was sent by a newspaper once to track down an Oswald lookalike. And in the diaries, it says they had about 3 or 4 lookalikes who were part of the plot. And the one that I know was Lovelady, I think was his name. And there was a famous picture of Lovelady on the front of Dealey Plaza, and everybody thought it was Oswald. And they said, how in the world could Oswald have been? No, not on Dealey Plaza. It's on the front of the building. What are they? The depository building. He's out there, and everybody said, "Well, how could he have shot if they had a picture?" It was Lovelady, and I know that for a fact because I tracked down his wife, and she told me that.
Okay, it's just fascinating stuff because so many of these leads, you could get into Billy Lovelady and it could take a long time to investigate, and it almost seems like the people who designed the plot put some of these things in to create false leads. Like you had been implying, there were lookalikes all over the place, so whoever did this was very sophisticated. And you did a great part in your book. It's just, a fascinating read when you describe what the diary says was going on in Dealey Plaza that day. And I just wanted to ask a little bit more about Oswald, if anything comes to your mind in that plot, like he had been, using an assumed name that day. There was a spotter over him. When he didn't want to shoot, the spotter could have shot him. He was aware of that. So if there's anything else in the plot, the summary in your book from the diary of the plot, I found a fascinating read, even if someone's a hardened, long-time investigator into the case. And I just wondered if you could speak to anything else that comes to your mind.
Well, it was intricately plotted, and all I do is report what's in the diaries. They came. They were not camouflage, but they you couldn't tell who they were. They met. There were these guys behind the shooters that if something went wrong, they would kill the shooter or take over. It was very intricate. They had sound things in the it said that they sounds of people screaming and so on. I'm not certain how that worked, but I would just have to leave it to that because it doesn't really. It was intricately plotted.
Well, even like it's in your book, like I was interested when it said some of the things they found were like nicks in the curbstone.
Yeah,
they were saying before the plot happened. The writer of the diary was saying basically these things were planned ahead of time, even days ahead of time.
Yeah.
So,
yes, it was intricately plotted, and there was somebody ahead of all of this plotting, and I don't know who that was, or if it was a bunch of people or what. But that's all I can say about that.
Well, you said quite a bunch, and you guys were great on the Shroud, and I advise anybody who's listening, all your books, Target Patent and the Shroud and Target JFK are all very worthy, and I thank you for being on today.
Bart, thanks a lot. I enjoyed it, and hope people get something out of it.
Yeah, Robert, I have one last question for you. Our format is new. It's called End Times Radio. It was formerly Conspiracy Corner News, and because I'm a believer as well, I realized that all that I hear on news endlessly is politics trying to save the world, and of course it's had its opportunity, I think so far for 6,000 years to no avail. And I realized that I wanted to transition into more about the meaning of life, eternal life, and judgment to come. And I did a documentary, about corruption in the federal government. I think, it represents, I guess, the struggle going on outside throughout the world between good and evil, and inside with men's hearts about the battle of good and evil. Could you maybe speak just a little bit about that in closing, about things about the plot of JFK and Patton, about how you think this speaks of the spiritual battle going on?
Well, I definitely believe in what you've said. There is a great battle between good and evil, and I believe it's there. And it gets very deep. Why are we here? What is our purpose? I think we're here to become Christ-like, and I quit smoking, so that's about as far as I'm getting so far. So it's going to be a tough time. And if I speak to what's going on right now, I see evil like I've never seen before. Especially, it's coming to me in the terms of the politics, about the way that the press distorts things and will not cover things that need to be covered because they have a political bias against it. And then our leaders, it's clear that in Washington they don't want to change. They don't want any change. Even the Republicans. I'm a conservative, and I can't believe what's going on. It's lying and cheating and stealing. And but I believe that good will prevail over evil, and that was a quick look at it. We're in a battle right now.
Yeah, definitely. We've read ahead to the ending revelation. We know that good will overcome evil. And I was thinking about that too, Robert. The purpose of life to me is simply a test of faith. When I look at the animal kingdom, for example, you see wolves, dog is a man's best friend, and that's kind of the closest wild version of it. And they mate for life. Can't be said of half of all adults end up being divorced. They can't even mate for life. And yet, if you throw a piece of meat in front of, the husband wolf and the wife wolf, the husband wolf, his animal nature will take over, and he'll growl if she approaches to take the food first. He can't overcome his animal nature. But humans, on the other hand, when we're starving, we can offer the last bit of food for survival to someone else. We have the ability. And so, to me, I think you're right. The purpose of life is to develop Christ-like character, or if you could say it's simply a test of faith. Either we live for the animal first and then worry about the spirit later, or we live for the spirit first and deny the animal. And I think that's kind of the sieve that sifts out souls for eternal life.
Well, I agree with everything you said, and really I was thinking, I've come to the point of what we're looking to is to become Christ-like, and I think a baby starts off that way, and faith is the most important thing. I really believe faith can move mountains, and it's just so hard to have faith, and that is the key. And I don't think many people ever learn that, but that really, to me, is the key. Faith. Faith will do it. And I believe that's true, and I believe that is a message that God gives us.
Well, that's a remarkable thing. The Bible says that things that we see, which is what most of the world lives for, is temporary, and things that we cannot see, eternal life and heaven, those are the things that will last forever. So
a child has faith too, like that, like I'm talking about, and you think about that. That's the kind of faith I think that they want. And when you go back to the Shroud of Turin, obviously real Christians don't have to believe in any kind of material witness to Jesus, but you like to have it. Look, here's a picture of him, and here's a proof of resurrection. But that I think it's a last thing for those people who are so dependent on material witness.
Yeah, well, maybe someday. I've always thought, I was telling you before we recorded, that I really don't like personally writing nonfiction, but I might, or producing documentaries. They're so tedious. But I've been tempted to do one about Noah's Ark. Maybe that's something we can work on in the future.
Yeah, that's a good subject. It's up there on Ararat, maybe.
Yep, but I've always wondered why they have guards around it. If it were not there, they'd say, "Come up, spend your tourist dollars looking for nothing, please."
Yeah.
But the fact that they don't want you there.
Talk about that one sometime.
I don't know much about Ararat. I know it's there, and I've looked at it as a possible book at times. But to me, it wasn't as interesting as the Shroud of Turin. So I don't know. But yeah, I'm always interested.
Well, if you write that book, then come on. But on the job with the Shroud, you guys hashing that one out was a great listen.
Good.
Well, thanks everyone for being here. This is Bart
and Bob
with End Times Radio with our guest Robert Wilcox, and we'll have a link in the description of the YouTube video for his website and the various books that we talked about. We wish everybody well, be blessed, and read your Bible.
First color photos ever of the Shroud of Turin. I was right in front of it, so I got an inside track, and that book Shroud was really my search for the truth kind of thing. And I went literally all over the world, all over the U.S., and I would take it's a scientific story, because I'll tell you right now, the Shroud is indecipherable at the least. It's the cloth which wrapped Jesus, in my belief, and that's from a scientific standpoint, not from any other standpoint. But when I wrote that first book, it was a big success. One of my most successful books, and then we went a long time, 75 until 2012. Okay, so you're looking at 40 years in between there, and in between there were these carbon 14s. The Shroud became so controversial, and let me say, it's not controversial amongst people who have studied it, but the press knows nothing about it. They still don't. It takes a while to understand it and to know what you're talking about, and so there's always this. Well, half think it's real and half don't. No, there was a scientific study, a group of scientists, and they either think it's inexplicable or they think it's the burial cloth of Jesus, the historical Jesus. There are only two people I know of who ever did any writing that it was not true. But of course, there have been a few little others, but who made any dent in that. And so anyway, I came back 40 years later, and it had many people then had heard of the Shroud. They know what it is. It has been, there have been many, many, many books and articles written about it since that time. And I went back and studied it all and took my search, which went from place to place, from scientist to scientist.
Greetings. Welcome to End Times Radio with Bart.
And Bob.
And we have as our guest today, Robert Wilcox. He's an award-winning, best-selling nonfiction and novel writer of Screams of Eagles, Wings of Fury, and Target Patton. The plot to assassinate General George S. Patton. Probably had a lot of people in line to do that one. His latest book is Target JFK, The Spy Who Killed Kennedy. In addition to his writing for film and television, he has reported for the New York Times, the New York Post, and written for numerous national and international publications, including the Miami Herald's Tropic Magazine, the Los Angeles Times, and National Geographic. He is a contributor to numerous web publications, including Breitbart and American Thinker. He started his career as a reporter and editor for the Miami News. During the Vietnam War, he was an Air Force information officer. I have to ask you what that is. And he lives at the moment in Los Angeles, and his website is robertkwilcox.com. Robert, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great. Thanks a lot. It's good to be with you.
Tell us, what does it mean to be an Air Force information officer during the Vietnam War?
Well, you are the spokesman for the unit or the colonel or the general, and your job is to liaison with the public, really, or if you're in a war zone or something, to just be the face and the voice of the unit, so that the rest of the guys can do their job. And you get to see everything. You're right there with the head guy and that kind of thing. So it was interesting, but I prefer not to be in the service, just so that I can do my writing.
Yeah, and I'm looking here, and I'm going to share it on the screen for people who will watch this and listen to it later on YouTube. You have quite a few books here. And of course, we're going to talk about Target JFK in the first half, and then the Shroud of Turin, a very fascinating subject to me. But you've written quite a bit. What was the first book that you wrote?
The first book I wrote was Shroud. It was the first, really the first big book here, actually the first book in English in America. Nobody had ever heard of the Shroud of Turin. This was back in 1977, and as a religion editor at the Miami News, I heard about it, and I was actually brought up as a Protestant, but when I heard that there might be some sort of tangible proof of Jesus and his resurrection, I jumped on that story, and I wrote a series of articles for the Miami News. They got a lot of interest. Nobody had ever heard of this thing. I mean, there was a little shrine in New York, and that was it. It was known in Europe a little bit, but not much. And so in those days, you could actually I went to New York, knocked on doors, and got a publisher. I got Macmillan, very fine publisher, and I wrote that book. That was the first book I wrote.
Well, let's talk a bit about that. I'm about 20 years younger than you, and it seems to me I remember hearing about the Shroud maybe in the 80s at first. It must have been from some of your articles, I suppose. And I grew up Catholic, stopped going the day it became voluntary. What a coincidence. And I always found it very fascinating. I did a little bit of research prior to this interview about it. But from what Bob was telling me, there's kind of like your original writing and this book here that I've got on the screen from Amazon that has some updated information. Is that right?
Yeah, well, it's a huge difference. The first book, I went to Europe. I was lucky at the time that I decided to do the book, the first one. They were going to take the shroud out to be seen for the first time since 1933. It was owned by the King of Italy. And I went on a bet, or on not a bet, but a hope that I would be able to see it. And I actually was right up there and made the from a material into pure energy, which of course we know today can happen now. That's all material is real energy. You have to take it back to its atoms and neutrons and so on. At that moment, something happened, and that body turned into a spiritual body, and that image was impressed. And I think that image, as the body lifted through the cross, through the shroud, it was put on there. And of course, that's speculation from me, from the facts, because how can you prove that happened? You can't, but you can go through all of the science that's there, and it's incredible. And so I wasn't looking to prove the message of Jesus, although I believe in the message of Jesus. I was just looking to see, what is this cloth? What is it? Is it really a picture of Jesus when he died after the crucifixion? As the scriptures tell us, he was put into a tomb, and there was a burial cloth put over him, and so on. It all coincides, but no, it was simply to do that. Now, since then, and because of what I found out, and because I've spent a lot of time examining my own life and so on, I do believe in the Christian message. I do believe Jesus was the Son of God, but this tries to stay as scientific as I can be, and it is scientific. It's just, I don't put my beliefs in on you. I tell you what the science tells us about the shroud.
Now, I remember hearing around that time, I was a teenager, that someone had done a carbon-14 dating of it, and it dated to around the 13th century like that. And then, of course,
Yeah.
when I read your discovery, you're saying that dating was incorrect because of the fiber was corrupted by burned ashes.
And however, built a lot of new information around it. So the book you're talking about, my latest, called The Truth About the Shroud of Turin, Solving the Mystery, is really all that had happened since then, and all of the science that has occurred since then, which really made it much more mysterious than it was when I had looked at it.
Now, you said you were looking for the truth. Were you talking about the truth about the shroud itself, or the truth about Jesus, to find evidence that Jesus was the Messiah?
No, the truth about the shroud. And listen, if the shroud is real, which I believe it is, that it did wrap the historical Jesus, it has in it a picture of the resurrection. This shroud has the face and body, entire body, of a crucified man on it. It is not a painting. There's no paint on it. It boils. It is so intricate that since I wrote the first book, scientists have found out that the image is a subtle thing, almost like I wouldn't want to say a burn, but like you would get from that light that will hit a white shirt and make it look ultraviolet light, and on every fiber of the image, this is very subtly put onto it, about only on the tips of the fiber. And so anyway, this is not a painting. It's not even an impression, because there are areas of the body that like the sides of the nose, which are on this image, which would have distorted this image if it were pressed down.